Good afternoon. My name is Paul Bennyworth from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And the presentation I'm going to give this afternoon is entitled Beyond Intrinsic Value Towards Useful Independence, or Independent Utility. Really what I want to do in this presentation today is to try and shed light on what I want to argue is one of the most pressing issues facing research today, namely, what is the value of arts and humanities research? My argument is that the political debate has reached an impasse. To get beyond that, I want to reflect on participants' interests and use that reflection to reframe the debate away from polarised positions and coming up with better understandings for the public value of arts and humanities research. And then that provides a basis for better measuring that value. Now, for me today, this is the first time that I've been able to participate remotely at a conference in a roundtable. And so I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of everyone, not only in the research, but of course the people that have made it possible for me to be here today. And in particular, I'd like to thank Elaine Ward, the session organiser, for suggesting that I make an electronic contribution today. So, in terms of background for the presentation, what I want to do, I come back to the point, I want to shed some light on a key challenge for arts and humanities research. Because we're facing a time when all research is under enormous pressure to justify itself. So my argument is that there's been effectively two debates, and they have been conducted in terms of two incompatible arguments. And so by exploring those arguments more closely, you can move beyond that disagreement to really get a deeper insight into what it is precisely about arts and humanities research that the public do value. So I want to say effectively that arts and humanities research, or the debate about its value, is trapped between a rock and a hard place. We have to acknowledge the reality that in public policy terms, funding for research can only be justified in terms of the social benefits that it brings. But at the same time, the way those social benefits have become defined has been increasingly restrictive in recent years to an almost exclusive focus on economic benefits, direct economic benefits, to the exclusion of wider social and cultural value. So the disagreement fundamentally is a disagreement that the measures that we have fail to capture what really matters about arts and humanities research. But unless we can adequately capture that value, then the funding for that research is doomed to wither. Now, I appreciate that I'm speaking to an American conference with a primarily American audience, whilst I am speaking to you physically located in Europe. So I think it's useful to provide some context very briefly about the way that I'm looking at the world. Now, clearly, from a European perspective, science and innovation policy is one of the tasks that the European Commission see as central to a successful, competitive and livable Europe in the coming century. So our research has primarily focused on Europe, partly because there is this common agenda, but partly because as a result of that agenda, there has been a huge pressure on academics and researchers to justify the social value of their research. So what we're talking about when we talk about Europe is the Europe that participates in the European research area. 27 members of the EU, plus a wider associated community including Norway, Iceland, Turkey and Israel. So what I want to start by is thinking about placing this in the context of a broader debate about valorization. The idea that scientific research creates economic impact by stimulating innovation. Now, valorization has always implicitly been important to research. It lay behind the German funding of the Humboldtian universities in the 19th century, and then in World War II, the US government made it quite an explicit desire, investing in science to create competitive military advantage. Valorization continued in a military flavour, but also increasingly from a civilian perspective in the 1950s and 1960s, becoming associated with the post-war reconstruction effort. Now, there was a slight disruption to this inevitable progress in 1968, where students complained about the opacity and privatization of universities as part of their dissatisfaction with society as a whole. But although there was a move in universities to democratize them and to return perhaps to the ivory tower, in 1980 we see in America the key moment in what made valorization, or what has framed the last 30 years of valorization, the Bayh-Dole Act. And this allowed universities to exploit federally funded research. It effectively made technology transfer by universities not only possible but desirable. And this was critical because in the 1980s and 90s, as Europe and America faced increasing economic competition from initially Japan but also a raft of other industrializing countries, national governments started to look to universities as a means of improving their competitiveness. So Bayh-Dole framed this idea of the technology transfer officer in university exploiting intellectual property from publicly funded research. And it was a very successful and popular model. But of course it was only ever a partial model for the public value of research, and clearly only applicable to some fields. Its attractiveness was clear. The idea of the high-stakes gamble, where you saw individual universities yielding sometimes billions of dollars in income from a single biotech patent. But of course, a question has to be asked about how research, which doesn't produce such easily exploited intellectual property, which doesn't fit into product development pipelines quite so easily as biotech does into FDA approval, how that could become valued. And critically for arts and humanities research, what we see is when one considers the way that it creates market value, the pathways within which the knowledge flows are much more diffuse. So the Food and Drugs Administration's approval process for a new chemical entity has become a world model, and it sets out clearly how a biotech patent will be exploited and create value through proof of principle, toxicity tests, in vitro and in vivo, and later population-wide trials. And in the end, the active ingredient in the pill will be clearly linked with the new chemical entity identified in the patent. So there is a clear value chain. By contrast, in the arts and humanities, the knowledge that comes out of the research potentially influences many people directly, but in a very small way that's very hard to measure, in transactions that are negligible. What we do know is there are a huge number of connections from arts and humanities researchers into the public in terms of the way they spend their time. A recent UK survey demonstrated that. But counting and measuring and enumerating those individual transactions is almost impossible. So against the background of the imperative of measuring the value of research, there is almost a sense that arts and humanities research can never demonstrate its value. Humanities scholars see themselves facing a mighty problem, the need to justify themselves, at the same time facing a profound discomfort that the measures that they do have fail to capture what it is about their research that really makes a difference. Now, it's important to acknowledge that alongside this, the researchers, the focus of my paper, have a sense that really no one in government or in the policy community is listening to their arguments, because they can clearly provide evidence on a project-wide basis of individual research making a difference to lives. But somehow, that does not add up to as compelling a story or argument as the hard sciences seem to have, and certainly policymakers do not seem to be listening to it. And so, that has cast a pall over humanities researchers' engagement with the policy community that I think we have to recognize. But if we take a step back and we think about where there is agreement, the literature demonstrates that we can see that it is uncontroversial to claim that arts and humanities research has value. So there's a macro argument that arts and humanities research provides a society with an interpretive capacity to understand other cultures, both in the past but also today, and to engage more fruitfully with those cultures, socially, culturally, but also economically. Now, there's a meso-argument that exists that arts and humanities education creates a workforce equipped with useful skills, and that humanities research and scholarship is a vital part of that education process. And then there are micro-arguments that can be made where a particular scholar can point to a user who has done something differently, perhaps a gas company that has routed their pipeline differently because of his knowledge of pre-Tsarist Russian tribal politics. And they can say, this is the impact that my research has had. All forms of impact. But where we see the disagreement is a conflict between a sense that there exist benefits that arts and humanities research can bring, on the one hand, which we agree, and on the other, a sense that arts and humanities research must always bring those benefits. And it's that second class that the policy community are particularly interested in, because they accept in the abstract that arts and humanities research may have value, but they are unconvinced by the stories that researchers tell them about that impact. So this is where we start to see the conflict. Public officials demanding an absolute proof of value, whilst academics arguing that although public meaning should be important to what they do, it should not be the defining characteristic, and certainly not a consideration influencing the way they conduct their research. And so we see, caught between these two demands, the argument has ground to a halt. Each side is, as well as arguing, is also accusing the other side of disingenuously misinterpreting reality for their own selfish interest. And it's that claims of disingenuity that I seek to get beyond. So public officials, on the one hand, argue that academics resist accountability because it is inconvenient for them as they carry out their luxurious hobbies, which public officials sometimes regard arts and humanities research as. Likewise, academics argue that their benefit is so clear to the public of what they do in teaching research that any attempt to measure that would distract them and impose an unacceptable burden on them. And public officials only want to be able to control them and therefore crush the life out of that research. Now, these arguments are interesting because although they create a fundamental disagreement, they are persistent and long-lived. And I think, to get beyond that, you have to start by assuming that the argument is not simply because the two sides are wrong-headed, but because the arguments themselves have a use, but when they come together, it creates a tension that is not currently resolvable. So I want to argue that what we need to do is look more closely at the social purpose served by those arguments to try and get beyond it. So the arguments about academics only being interested in knowledge for its own sake, the hobby of research, is true in a certain sense. But the point is that it is true because it is a norm of the academic community that has emerged to ensure independence in the research effort. If research only targets those projects that have immediate applicability, then I think we can all agree that the field of research becomes overly concentrated and weak, and ultimately will die out. The claim is made by policymakers because it is important that non-academic users can engage in the way that research questions are set. There is a sense sometimes that academics, in arts and humanities particularly, retreat into themselves and have a jargon-ridden conversation about what matters. So public policy officials want to say that there should be a voice in determining what are the interesting questions from the user community, not just in industry, but also society more generally. And so the resolution to this might be user participation in the arenas which decide the academically interesting questions and how research funding is allocated, how journal papers are selected, how conferences are organised. Now, the second argument that arts and humanities research is morally uplifting and therefore doesn't have to justify itself is easily debunked, because we've seen, and Eleonora Belfiore has written a marvellous book in which she demonstrates how arts and humanities can become a refuge for scoundrelry and dissembling, teaching someone how to take evidence and present an entirely false argument. And we see its culmination in the academic sphere in the UK, for example, in the trial about denying the Holocaust, where a historian had taken some evidence and made an untrue story out of it. But there's a point about the purpose of academic freedom. and arts and humanities as being a field divorced from the quotidian pressures of survival, and providing, across society as a whole, individuals with a means to experience sublime enjoyment. That is to say, enjoyment that is divorced from the grind of reality of having to secure one's own survival in a competitive world. So, arts and humanities research, the value is equipping citizens to enjoy and appreciate that additional dimension of their lives. In that sense, liberating them from a bondage of survival by giving them the capacity that formerly only the senators of the Roman Empire had, which is to enjoy knowledge for its own sake. But the point is that that is not automatic. Freeing our arts and humanities research from some kind of accountability requirement would allow that to be delivered more easily. But what is ultimately important is that the capacity that it provides citizens with to engage with a liberated element of their life, in effect, for individuals to develop socially. So to bring the argument and the discussion to a conclusion, I would ask, is there a common ground contained in these two rationales which allows us to reframe the debate about arts and humanities research's value away from these two polar opposites? So the first argument is effectively that arts and humanities research is dependent at least part on its utility, but a utility that ultimately is affected by ideas of academic excellence. So utility shapes the search process but does not dominate it. The second argument is that the value of that research can often be quite indirect, but ultimately contributes to social development, to people living more fulfilled lives. And here we start to see one of the problems that emerges in understanding the value of arts and humanities research. Although it's not uncontroversial to equate and simplify economic growth to being what we mean by economic development, we don't have such a clear definition of what we mean by social development, this liberation of the individual from the quotidian. We have an understanding of things like universal literacy and infant mortality reduction. But beyond that, social development is a much more political question. What does a society want to achieve, and what does it regard as being positive in moving towards achieving those goals? So, I would argue that here we start to see in tying arts and humanities research more closely to a sense of social development, we can start to understand, at least partly, how arts and humanities research, its value is produced. And this suggests that we need to focus on, to understand, and hopefully at some point be able to measure two things. And this is my conclusion. So these two things are, we need to understand, firstly, the arenas where problems are set. And in particular, academics' demands to and willingness to allow external problem users to come in and influence the way in which interesting research questions are set. The second is that there needs to be more explicitness about the social development model in terms of quality of life, in terms of happiness, to which arts and humanities research are expected to contribute, both in terms of their direct contributions, but also more generally, where is society going, and how can arts and humanities research contribute to that? So these two areas provide a focus for our future research. I hope they will provide a focus for the discussion that we're going to have today, and I look forward to hearing indirectly reported to me the outcomes of those discussions. Thank you very much.